let's understand technically how this works. Market economy status, according to the Article 15 of China's accession to the WTO, whether or not the European countries grant China so-called market economy status, China is going to have it anyway by the time December the 12th, 2016, which means the end of this year. Isn't that true, Mr. Pelkmans?
Well, certainly it's very difficult to deny that the legal clause in Article 15 that you refer to is unambiguous. But the real issue is not that, even though the Chinese think that is an issue. It's symbolic for them. The real issue is, A, what are the underlying economic circumstances inside China, and what can be done even when the MES, the market economy status, would be granted, as you say, automatically to China. These are the real two issues. Because you can grant the MES and still do a hell of a lot against China if they have good reasons. And these reasons are inside China for the most part, that we can maybe talk on later in this discussion.
Okay, whether it's all inside China or actually the European economies also have their reasons for this participating at least actively in this debate is another question. Let me go to you, Mr. Casarini. This is another difficult or technical issue. This is non-binding. So it means even though the Chinese economy could be having already at the end of the year market economy status according to the accession paper, the European countries have to have the European Commission to come up with a formal suggestion before the Parliament's members vote on it, which means the one that we are talking about right now is non-binding and not necessarily official. Did I understand right?
Yes, it is not binding, but it will have important implications. Why? Because it will give more clout to those member states, in particular the southern European countries, such as Italy, France, and also Spain and Portugal, etc., that are against granting China market economy status. Let's also not forget that the European Parliament will have to give a vote of approval in the end. And this is like a new thing that the European Parliament has gained over the Commission. So although it is not binding, it will have an effect because it will move the European Commission into having to take into consideration the reasons of those member states which are currently against market economy status.
All right, so we got two things clear already, at least from the European perspective. One is legal, the other is political. Let's come to you, Mr. Xu, here in Beijing. Is it still important for China to get, quote unquote, this so-called market economy status?
I think it's important because China has got the same endorsement from over 150 countries. And also it's important because so far the success of China's reform is very much underpinned by external pressure. So external pressure is actually very conducive for China's continued reform. But at the same time, I also believe even China does not get that. I mean, China will continue to move forward.
It's very interesting you talk about the number of countries who have recognized China's market economy status. Let's take a look at some of those. According to WTO, in the year 2014, take a look at this. Its members have launched 236 anti-dumping cases with 63 involving China, about 27% of the total. China is involved in more anti-dumping cases than any other countries so far. That's because China is not being recognized totally by all countries as a market economy status. But up to now, we've already got a very significant number. 150, more than that, have already granted China so-called market economy status, such as Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Singapore, and many others. So by paper, as we mentioned earlier, Mr. Xu, by the end of the year, December the 12th, 2016, whether so-called you grant it or not, automatically China believes it's already a market economy. That was an agreement in China's WTO accession paper signed with all countries.
Yep.
So what would that mean for China? How much really the anti-dumping cases is having a negative impact on the Chinese economy and trade, particularly?
Anti-dumping is a very relevant issue at this juncture for several reasons. Most economies are struggling, slow growth, that's particularly in Europe. Secondly, China is undergoing a very challenging transformation. You want to maintain certain growth rate, you also want to deal with overcapacity and inventory and so on and so forth. So as you can see, anti-dumping becomes more acute issue this year, particularly in certain sectors which are always very sensitive for certain European countries. Steel sector, for example. I mean, the EU started with alliance in steel and coal, so that sector is very important.
Mr. Pelkmans, we all understand steel lobbying inside the EU countries are extremely strong. And we also understand for a country like the UK, 5,000 jobs have been slashed as a result of the restructuring of economies everywhere in the world, which means a reduction of demands for steel from the UK and elsewhere. But Mr. Pelkmans is at this moment refusing so far apparently to grant China's market economy status a direct link to China's own economic restructuring, or actually to what you have inside the EU for your reluctance to restructure your own economies? Mr. Pelkmans.
Well, I think there's now so many issues already before. If we focus only on steel, it's a little dangerous because.
But
steel
what about
is the
steel?
big political.
Yeah, but what about steel? Let's talk about
it's
steel
and
first.
ceramics. Yeah, it's steel and ceramics. All the other things are more or less normal anti-dumping things. Occasionally they use MES, but if we have no MES, it's really coming down to steel and ceramics, where the overcapacities in China, and I'm no longer so young, but I've never ever seen anything coming even near to these overcapacities. So it's a bit weird to talk about overcapacities in Europe, which are tiny. At the moment there is some of it, but I mean you talk about way over 100 times as much in China, and that's a Chinese very expensive problem for China.
It is an
We have
expensive.
roughly
Let me just get the thing clearly here. What we talk about now is the Europeans' decision of not to grant China's market economy status. It's not about how China is streamlining its own economy. It's already going on. That China is restructuring its economy. As a result of that, there has been a reduction of demands world over of steel from any country, including from the European countries. And now what you have inside the Europeans that we can also read from many stories covered by international press, it is mainly the steel industry that is doing the biggest lobbying, supporting not to grant China with the market economy status. So let me just ask you directly, and could you please give me a direct answer, Mr. Pelkmans? What about the steel industry? How much
I was
hope,
giving it, but you interrupted me.
Oh yes, how much hope? Let me just
the steel issue.
Go ahead, sir, if you can.
Yeah, I am an independent. I don't care about any industry. I think of my own. But China's overcapacity in steel is huge and it's long. It doesn't depend on the recent demand fall, which of course has made it worse. Also, the price of steel in the world market have been suppressed. I mean, roughly suppressed. You talk about 30–40% fall because of the China overcapacity. It's not just that Europe has a problem. The problem is that the Chinese overcapacity spill over to the rest of the world economy and have negative effects. Of course it's true that in Britain there is one additional element of the energy prices, but on the continent that's not so. On the continent, and you heard Mr. Casarini speak about some of the southern Italy, Spain and so on. there the sensitivity is not so much on energy, it's really on the dramatic fall and of course a huge import surge from China in the last 1.5 years.
All right.
So I am not so happy with all this anti-dumping business in MES, but I cannot deny the fact that the overcapacities in China should, if China is a market economy, should have led these firms to go broke. Because you cannot have overcapacity, then you make gigantic losses. That is the core of the issue, and that is why the steel lobbies, even if they are lobbies, you're completely right, have a case in Europe because they say, why are these guys not broke?
Got your point, but
they are protected.
Got your point, but the relevant question should also be asked, since the EU countries are already quote-unquote market economies, and therefore why don't the EU governments or the countries just let all of those steel manufacturers go bankrupt rather than listening to your strong lobbies? Mr. Casarini,
well,
if you
first
can,
of all,
let's also give Mr. Casarini a chance to talk. Mr. Casarini, if you can.
As you wish.
Okay.
We wish.
Thank you. This is an important topic, and you're actually right. There are like important and powerful steel lobbies against the granting China market economy status, in particular from Italy and the UK. And the UK government, let's remember, is officially in favor of market economy status, but the steel lobby is against the granting of the status. Now, the problem is double. On the one hand, you mentioned 150 countries which have recognized China market economy status, but those countries do not have a large industrial base at risk as much as many of the member states within the European Union which are against. Second point, the lobbies are powerful today because of the growing unemployment. I'm speaking with the Tour Eiffel behind. Let's remember, it's not just Italy and the UK, also France is battling against growing unemployment. So any kind of lobby, industrial lobby, which tries to convince politicians that granting China market economy status would translate into the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs would be listened carefully by lawmakers, in particular the European Parliament, which can take non-binding agreements. So I think this explains a bit more why the steel lobby can have so much clout nowadays in the discussion.
This is a very unique situation. You've got already the economic circumstances of countries different from 15 years ago when China signed the WTO. You also got the Chinese economy at a very different stage at this moment. So, Mr. Xu, how do you understand this? Is it still important for China?
I think it's important for China to restructure the economy, but it's also important for China to do that perhaps in a measured fashion, because in the end, you are dealing with the human beings. In the end, you are dealing with a very large sector involving million jobs. I do believe the government is serious about restructuring, but of course you have to do that in a measured way. At the same time, perhaps we should also listen to the voice from Europe. In the end, I think it's going to be some sort of compromise. I do think China should make the restructuring plan perhaps more concrete. And actually it's in China's best interest to restructure certain sectors, particularly steel, so that the sector can become commercially viable.
May I, from the Chinese perspective, ask you even more about that? Because you see steel industry, of course, as Mr. Pelkmans mentioned many times and recognized by the Chinese side for a long time, and actions being taken about try to change the overcapacity of steel companies, particularly those smaller ones, non-functional ones. But at the same time, it has to be done over time. Yet overcapacity is not necessarily the reason why a market economy status should be granted and should not be granted.
Right.
So we're talking about two things. One is things that might lead to discussions about the market economy status, but not necessarily direct factors influencing the status itself. So at this moment, as we're approaching December the 12th, very soon, how all sides should be handling this? If I could just add in a few more complicated factors, Mr. Xu. This is not just about the status of the market economy itself. It's also about promises made to both sides between China and European countries.
Yep.
It's also about the basic principles of WTO. And it is also about having a more diversified geopolitics in the world in which China and the European Union and European countries are playing an ever bigger role toward one another. So all of these seem to be things that could be related to the overall discussion. Mr. Xu, this makes things ever more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, to put it simply, China has been benefiting from free trade and globalization, and protectionism would hurt China more than other countries. So it's in China's best interest to listen to our trading partners' concerns, opinions, and meanwhile, we do need to have a more concrete plan in terms of restructuring, for example, zombie companies, not commercially viable companies. Yes.
But at the same time, what does it say to China if the European countries, as China sees it, does not carry its promises, as Mr. Wang, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, said in his recent response toward the news?
That would be somewhat disappointing because, for example, Russia was getting market economy status from European Union. Even a country like Ukraine has received that status many, many years ago. So, I mean, it's difficult to argue China is less market-driven than some other countries.
Interesting. Yeah. Mr. Pelkmans, what do you say about the larger impact of the failure to grant China the market economy status, or further debates and disputes about this between China and the European countries, economically and also trade-wise, in the long term?
Yeah, in the long term, I think it's obvious that MES should not only be given, but should be practiced in what it means, namely that two market economies, namely China and the EU, trade, and I hope trade a lot and invest in an as free as possible environment. There's a longer run, but at the moment, in the very short run, yeah, as my Chinese colleague just said, this has to be cleared. And whether you do that in 3 or 5 years, that's a very painful period inside China, but also to some extent for us. And that can be done, but not without pain. We have had a steel crisis in the EU, not as gigantic as yours, but still pretty big, between 77 and the early 90s. And I can tell you, we did it too long, and we did it in a very painful and dragged out manner, so we know what we're talking about. No, I absolutely agree. If MES stands for what it's meant, Yong Tu has been very clear all along, because I know him for many years back. This is really about what is behind it. If China wants to become a market economy, then these things would only very rarely or hardly ever occur. Then we would have normal anti-dumping procedures, which many countries do, and this MES thing adds let's say 20-25% to the anti-dumping duties, and that's a lot. And the idea behind it is that it compensates for the artificially low price because you're not a market economy.
Okay, we understand how the anti-dumping works. Yes, indeed, and the price to pay for it. Mr. Casarini, briefly, because we only have very limited time left, from you, what about the longer term and the bigger impact of this discussion? The reason that even the discussion exists, that there are suspicions from one side about the other's lack of implementing promises. What would that mean for China-EU in the longer-term economic and trade ties?
That's the most important question, as you rightly mentioned, the future of EU-China relations. First point, the fact that we are discussing is already a good point. Let's remember the United States have already declared they will not recognize China market economy status. So the fact that the European Union is leaving the door open to an eventual compromise is already a success. Second point, I think that if a compromise is achieved, and I do hope that we will have a compromise by December, I think it will boost actually EU-China relations. So this kind of like discussions that we have, like the Chinese foreign minister, like saying that the Europeans don't keep the promises. The Europeans are accusing China not to have done enough in order to transform their economy. Those are useful. We are speaking about the possibly most important economic relationship in the world. So any kind of discussion along this line will be useful, and we hope that by December a compromise will be reached, and it will be a key point. Also towards a more diversified global economy, as you mentioned, because it will also send a message to countries like the United States, Japan. They're still reluctant in discussing as to whether grant China market economy status. At least in Europe, we discuss about that.